So, good morning. My comments today are entitled "We Don't Have to Change Everything." And this is still sort of in the theme we've been talking about with, how we are in the world and perfectionism and things like that. So, part of Western competitive culture that we talk about, which we're exposed to at a very early age, is often a sense of incompleteness. We feel we sort of grow up feeling we're not enough. And sometimes it's hard to pinpoint, but it's sort of like there's a hole somewhere in there. And for all the years that I was in practice and doing psychotherapy, I heard a variation on this theme every day in my office. And when I explored it with folks and looked at it within myself, it was always this long-standing nagging feeling, and often rooted in comparing ourselves to others or to cultural expectations and cultural demands. It begins really early. It begins often in preschool. Once we begin socializing with others, is so and so smarter, faster, has cooler toys, whatever. Or sometimes it begins even before then with our siblings. But it's often about things like our appearance, our achievements, our possessions, our need to be perfect in this highly competitive culture, which we feel we have to meet these milestones in order to be loved and accepted. And when we fall short, or when we feel we fall short, and that's usually our own perception, um, we suffer. And this is undergirded or sort of, supported by our evolutionary history. When our ancient ancestors, they lived with this chronic sense of something missing, but that really had more to do with their survival. It might have to do with nourishment is missing or shelter is missing or whatever, and it kept them on high alert for their safety and for them seeking resources for their survival. But we've kind of kept it and then imposed it upon a modern life with all this comparing and competition that exists, and as I said, in our culture. But whatever the source, it causes us suffering. To the extent that we buy into it or do nothing to confront it or look at it. The good news is that the Dharma, our practical Dharma tools, help us manage it and help us confront it. Don often reminds us wisely of the concept of good enough. And if we keep that notion of good enough front and center, it's really the beginning of the way of sort of letting go of this sense of incompleteness. So we can set an intention to apply this standard of good enough to ourselves. To see that there is a wholeness, a completeness uh, that's good enough, not perfect, but good enough within ourselves. It's a broader, more spacious view of ourselves rather than this narrow sort of view of inadequacy, which comes from our ego, from the being prisoners of our ego. So self-acceptance recognizes a wholeness which is wise, compassionate, and good enough, though not perfect. You may recall, and we've talked about this, Rick Hanson, the psychologist and Dharma teacher in California, reminds us that our minds are Velcro for the negative and Teflon for the positive, which is another vestige of our evolutionary history. That idea that if our ancient ancestors saw danger where none existed, no big deal. But if they failed to see danger where it existed, they didn't survive to keep their genes in the gene pool. In other words, evolution selected for those who overestimated danger and survived versus those who underestimated danger and did not. And in our modern times, this takes the form of seeing our faults and shortcomings more readily than our positive quality. And comparing mind, which we all carry around, only adds to this tendency because we're always prone to doing those comparisons. We end up wanting then to push away our bad parts, our bad emotions, or whatever they are, as unacceptable because we see them as signs of weakness or failure. And what this does, it prevents us from looking at, much less accepting, all of who we are with compassion. you know, the good parts and the not so good parts, which is and by doing that, by not looking at those parts with compassion, it's a primary source of feeling that we're not enough, that there's something fundamentally wrong with us, and we suffer because of it. Because we cling to the idea that we should be more than we are and are falling short of the goal, however it manifests in our lives. But let me propose that what if nothing is wrong? What if there's nothing to fix? And I think that's what these teachings offer us, that we shift our focus towards self-acceptance, towards self-compassion, and toward being good enough. I love that term, and ever since Don reminded us of it some months ago, it's just kind of continued to resonate with me. We feel gratitude for this life that we've been given, for all the gifts of this life that have been given, and particularly in the realm of our connection to others. If, as our ancient ancestors had to do, we're fleeing from the saber-toothed tiger in the form of the parts of ourselves we think that prove we're not good enough, we're going to suffer. So we're not fleeing the tiger, but we're certainly fleeing the parts of us that aren't good enough. What if instead we open to the spaciousness of our lives, celebrate the joy of them, all the while using the tools that we talk about here at Serenity? To do so, we make time for quiet. We make time for activating the parasympathetic nervous system with our breathing, the rest and relax part, to unplug, to take a nature bath, as the Japanese call it, to put our phones away, to turn off our screens, to cultivate a sense of awe about the mysteries of life. All of that creates a spaciousness that takes us out of this not good enough mindset. Can we see the world with a beginner's mind, with a fresh eyes that the Zen folks talk about? Sometimes it helps to connect with a friend who sees us through a different set of eyes than we see ourselves. We're so self-critical. Doing so, we discover that we're good enough just as we are, and we can begin to confront that nagging sense that the comparing competitive society has instilled in us, that there's something lacking. There's nothing lacking there. We are fine as we are. So I'm going to stop there, and let's talk about not good enough and good enough.